When it comes to government, is bigger necessarily better? I'll be right back. One of the most frustrating feelings for the average man is that of helplessness as he attempts to deal with government that seems ever to grow bigger and more centralized. He watches in near helplessness as Big Brother determines more and more what's best for him and at the same time grows more distant. The average citizen throws up his hands in dismay whenever he contemplates the possibility of having to deal with the federal government, the state government, or even the governments of most large cities. The saying that you can't fight City Hall is usually an understatement. Most of the time, you can't even find who it is in City Hall you want to fight. Bigness in itself is no sin, but nevertheless in this country we've always tried to see that nothing got so big it became unmanageable. For that reason, we have antitrust laws aimed at keeping bigness in business and industry from becoming all-encompassing. Unfortunately, on another front, organized labor, we've done nothing to stop unions from getting so big and so powerful they become the masters rather than the servants of their members and often pose a threat to the stability of our entire economy. And on still another front, government, we've voted into office year after year legislators and executives who push for bigger, more powerful government and more centralized authority, all in the name of doing what is best for the people. So, while we don't like it, we must admit that much of the fault is our own. We've complained about big government, but then we've voted for it. One reason probably is that many voters have fallen for the old line that small government is ineffective, is unable to deal with our problems, is inefficient, and is expensive. We've been told that only big government with its accompanying high salaries attracts competent managers and honest legislators. Well, don't you believe it? One of the things we did in California in 1973 was to put to work a task force to study the possibility of local government reform, to see if in fact we could get better and more responsive government by consolidating some of our very small units of government. We had seen a 1966 study by the Committee for Economic Development, which in brief advocated fewer and larger governments, reduction of duplication and overlap, and provision of one visible center of authority. And on the surface that looked pretty good. If by consolidating governments you can make a government more effective and more responsive to the citizens' needs, then that's the way to go. But our task force refused to take that 1966 study as gospel. Instead, it began its study from scratch. And after nearly a year's work, this is what it found. And I quote, "A system of highly flexible and independent local government units is as capable or more capable of providing the quality of service that people expect than is a centralized and consolidated government system," unquote. It goes on to say that consolidation of local governments would actually produce a system less likely to provide public services of a quality and at a cost that suit the diverse preferences of the average citizen. In other words, bigger, when it comes to government, isn't necessarily better or cheaper. The next time someone tells you that consolidated government or regional government is the only way to go, just remember that song from Porgy and Bess. It ain't necessarily so. This is Ronald Reagan. Thanks for listening. What happens to citizen participation when government units consolidate? I'll be right back. Yesterday I discussed a study on local government reform which must have confounded the liberal establishment wherever it was read because it gave the lie to that old saw that only big government can meet the needs of the people. The study to which I refer was done, I must admit, by a task force I appointed in 1973 when I was still governor of California. It was and is one of those rarities, a study done by a group of independent experts that came up with answers totally contrary to the conventional wisdom of our day. Some of these answers, it found, are worth repeating because they reflect feelings the average man finds difficult to express, and when he does express them, finds all too often that those in authority will not listen. For instance, the study found that the average citizen's satisfaction with government increases as the size of the governmental unit gets smaller. He also found that there's a strong desire among the people for decentralizing governmental authority and responsibility. In large central cities, there's also a significant demand for some form of neighborhood organization to affect the delivery of public goods and services. Power to the people, it seems, is more than just a radical slogan. It's also a need felt by a good many citizens. The study also finds that there's a strong preference by citizens toward maintaining the autonomy of local governments and that they want to decide the structure of their local government at the ballot box rather than through the legislature or even through appointed local officials. Our study also took a look at local government reform in socialist Sweden, where they reduced the number of local governments from 2,500 to 250. They found that these things resulted. Voter participation in local elections declined. Citizen participation in volunteer civic and service organizations declined. Local elected officials began to differ markedly from the bulk of their constituents and tended to follow the dictates of their consciences rather than the wishes of their constituents. And finally, the resistance of elected officials to spending programs decreased. It's all quite reminiscent of what's been happening here in America in recent years as government has grown bigger and more powerful. Here, too, voter participation has been declining. Fewer and fewer people are taking an interest in volunteer activities. It's easier to let the government do it. Too often our elected officials cease to represent us and instead inflict their views on us. And finally, you may have noticed, the bigger government gets, the bigger a chunk of our income it takes, and the more it spends on your behalf, whether you want it or not. A little bit of Sweden, it appears, is a little bit of knowledge. It can be a dangerous thing to our heritage of keeping government close, responsive, and responsible to the people. We've already lost a lot of that heritage. Only we, the people, can make sure that we don't lose it all. This is Ronald Reagan. Thanks for listening.